want to talk about the New York Giants. And, this 2024 season just continues to be awful. And we'll see how it goes down the final, month or so here going into the offseason. But I was talking to some people going into the Week 12 games, both Giants fans and people who are otherwise indifferent. But I said that Joe Schoen needs to go. If they bring him back next year, it would be a mistake. It would be just delaying the inevitable. I said firing Joe Schoen doesn't necessarily mean that Brian Daboll is going to be fired. And while that is generally not how it goes, right, usually in a circumstance of a general manager being fired, the coach also goes with him. But my caveat was the Giants would need to be competitive. They would need to show some fight to justify Brian Daboll coming back. Not necessarily the number of wins down the stretch here, but how does it look? How do the games feel? And I thought they had a perfect opportunity going into last Sunday against a Tampa team coming in on a 4-game losing streak. Now, Tampa's a good team, but it's not exactly the Lions or the Vikings coming to town. And then the Giants got destroyed in their building. The game was over well before halftime. And then you see all the negativity in the post-game comments from Malik Neighbors and some of the other players. Neighbors wasn't mincing words about what he thought of his opportunities in that game. And that caught my attention a little bit because it's usually not the players you hear the effort stuff from in post-game pressers. It's usually some form of a coach doing so while passive-aggressively venting. And then they usually, try to walk it back on Monday or Tuesday and say that's not what they meant or is taken out of context, whatever. But besides the point. I thought it gave us an idea as to just what the vibes are in that building. Now, look, to be fair, Malik Neighbors is the Giants' best offensive player by a long shot. Now, I will point out, he has the highest target share among wide receivers up to this point in the season. And we're not talking just rookie wide receivers. All wide receivers in the NFL. So questioning targets is a little bit hollow in that circumstance. And regardless of how good you are, if you're a rookie, I would not expect those comments about his teammates' effort. But this is what happens in losing organizations. And then you go to the Thanksgiving game against the Cowboys. A little bit of a better showing, but the game was also not as close as the final score would indicate. I mean, the Giants were down by 2 scores for a large portion of that second half. They got a touchdown to cut it to a 1-score deficit late in the game with, I want to say, 3 minutes left. But Dallas is not any good. And now the Giants are 2-10. And here are their final 5 games. They host the Saints and the Ravens. Then they go to Atlanta. They're back home against the Colts. And then they go to Philadelphia to finish the season. The Giants are going to be underdogs in all of those games. The question is, and I think Brian Daboll's future depends on this, can the Giants be competitive in those remaining games? Or are they just going to get their asses kicked for the next month plus? Time will tell. But back to my point that Joe Schoen should be out. Hard stop. Xavier McKinney and Saquon Barkley, both guys are going to be on all pro teams in 2024. Xavier McKinney was a second-round pick out of Alabama back in 2020. Now, he struggled with injuries in his rookie season, but then in 2021, he started 16 of 17 games. He picked off 5 passes. He then had another injury-shortened year in 2022. And in 2023, he bounces back and was one of only 2 defensive players in the entire NFL to play every snap. And he set career highs in tackles and passes defended. And he also had 3 picks. The Giants decided to let him walk. He signs with Green Bay for 4 years, $67 million. And all he's done is just become a complete ball hawk for one of the best teams in the NFC. He is currently tied for the league lead in interceptions with 7. He started the year with 5 straight games in which he recorded a pick. Saquon Barkley is most likely going to win the Offensive Player of the Year, potentially even the league MVP. He has a really good chance at leading the league in rushing and also setting the all-time single-season rushing mark, as well as the all-time single-season yards from scrimmage record. And the Giants also let him walk. And all of this goes back to not picking up Daniel Jones' 5th-year option back when they hired Brian Daboll. For context, Joe Schoen was hired by the Giants in January of 2022 after several seasons as the assistant general manager to Brandon Beane in Buffalo. And during Schoen's time with the Bills, they drafted Josh Allen, and for 4 of the 5 seasons that he was with the organization, Daboll was the Bills' offensive coordinator. Well, then after Joe Schoen is hired by the Giants to be the general manager, he hires Brian Daboll like a week or so after. Now, given that timing, Daboll was hired in, I don't know the exact date, but let's just call it late January of 2022. They had 3 full months, so February, March, April, to make a decision on whether or not they would be exercising the 5th-year option for Daniel Jones. Now, understandably, it would have gotten some heat at the time. Daniel Jones was really bad through the first 3 seasons. There's no denying that. Statistically, he was bad. Bunch of turnovers. The Giants were not winning football games. But the reason I continue to point to this, and I originally said it, I probably sound like a broken record. We first brought this up back in spring of last offseason. If the Giants would have picked up Daniel Jones' 5th-year option, which they would have needed to do by early May of 2022, right? Like the date fluctuates year to year, but let's just say for the most part, it's anywhere between May 1st and May 5th. That would have prevented what we actually saw play out with the Giants. So to jog your memory, only first-round draft picks are eligible to have their 5th-year option exercised. And essentially what that means is going into that first-round draft pick from 3 years prior, going into their 4th season, or May of that offseason going into the 4th season, if you exercise the 5th year on them, then they will be on your books for the 4th year of their rookie deal, which they would have been anyway. And then they have a guaranteed number, which is calculated based on position and career achievements up to that point. So it's not the same for every single player, even if they're the same position. But for the most part, the calculus that goes into it is what position do you play and what have you accomplished up to that point. And so with Daniel Jones, his 5th-year option would have been for 2023, because remember, Daniel Jones was drafted in the first round in 2019. So going into 2022, had they picked up that 5th year, let's say everything plays out exactly the way it did in real life. 2022, the Giants go 10-6-1. They make a playoff game, and give them credit, they go on the road to Minnesota. They win a road playoff game. 2022 was, they overachieved. I don't think anybody thought Brian Daboll's going in there and they are going to make the postseason and then win a playoff game, right? I think that was well beyond what the expectations were. Well, Daniel Jones' fifth-year option, which would have been paid in 2023, would have had him making, somewhere between $22 and $23 million for that season. And again, he was scheduled to make about $4.2 million in 2022 on the fourth and final year of his rookie contract. Now, in terms of how that would have counted against the cap, it would have been about $8.4 million charged, or I should say it was $8.4 million charged against the cap that year. But either way, from a quarterback contract perspective, that is next to nothing. Well, statistically speaking, 2022 Daniel Jones, that was his most effective year in terms of wins, losses, and that was his most efficient year. But at the end of the day, he averaged about 200 yards per game through the air, and he finished the season with 15 touchdown passes against 5 interceptions. So the idea that, again, the way it actually played out was they didn't pick up his fifth-year option, and instead, in the offseason going into 2023, they signed him to an absurd contract at 4 years for $160 million. I want to say there was, 80 plus guaranteed. And that all would have been avoided had they simply picked up the fifth year. Because let's go back to last year. Remember how that looked? The Giants were terrible. They took a massive step backwards. Now, to be fair, the offensive line was dreadful. Daniel Jones was, had guys in his face. It felt like every snap. But he did not play well. He certainly regressed compared to 2022. So he didn't play well. Then, and you can't forecast this, but his season is cut short due to the knee injury. And the Giants are dreadful in 2023. Well, had they picked up that fifth year going into 2022, yes, it would have been more money than they should have paid Daniel Jones in 2023. But here's the kicker. They could have at that point, right? So going into this past offseason, right? They could go to Daniel Jones and his agent and go, look, you took a major step backward in 2023, injury or otherwise, shitty offensive line play or whatever you want to look at. You are not worth, at this time, one of these massive quarterback contracts. And the Giants, from an organizational perspective, would have had the flexibility to say, look, we will bring you back at what ultimately would have been a fraction of what that 4-year deal they signed Daniel Jones to was. Well, let's just say, hey, look, Daniel, you're coming off an injury. You're coming off a year in, you took a step forward in 2022. You took 2 steps back in 2023. We'll give you 2 years, $22 million. We'll guarantee 10, and we'll give you an opportunity with incentives to make, 13 or 14. Again, a fraction of what they actually ended up paying Daniel Jones in 2023. But they didn't have that luxury because they rolled into 2022 in a situation where after a successful year, they then had to make a decision on Saquon Barkley or Daniel Jones. Now, Saquon Barkley, if you recall, was drafted 1 year ahead of Daniel Jones. Barkley was the number 2 overall pick in the 2018 NFL draft. And he had an immediate impact, right? Awesome rookie season. And even though, Saquon during his time with New York, there were, he dealt with some injuries and there were missed games. And, obviously overall his production took a hit during those seasons. But in 2022, he was clearly the team's best player. He was the reason they would not have sniffed the playoffs if they did not have Saquon Barkley that year. And to roll into that offseason and be dicking around with, are they going to pay him? Are they not going to pay him? Well, they ultimately made their choice and they franchise tagged Barkley, and then they signed Daniel Jones to just a ridiculous contract. And then, you ran into the rest of that, the way that offseason played out, Barkley saying, well, I'm not going to play under the franchise tag. And they effectively came to an agreement where Barkley he didn't play the 2023 season under the franchise tag, but in terms of compensation, it wasn't far off, right? Like they guaranteed the money, but the franchise tag also guarantees the money, but they guaranteed, I want to say maybe a little bit more money, and then said, hey, look, you also have the ability to earn, X amount in incentives. So 2023, disaster season for the Giants. And then we all saw the way the 2024 offseason played out with the Giants. I can't keep track of all the hard knocks seasons, right? You have like the traditional hard knocks, before the season. Then you have the in-season hard knocks. And I don't know what the Giants were on. I mean, what the official title is. Like, is it off-season hard knocks? Whatever. Point being, they had that clip where Joe Schoen calls Saquon Barkley, and the discussion is basically, hey, Saquon, feel free. Go test the open market. And that's exactly what he did. And the Philadelphia Eagles signed Saquon to 3 years, I want to say something like $39 million, total contract value. Now, look, it's the NFL. It very rarely do you see the, total terms or the terms of what the total contract is actually end up being the real monies paid to the player. But let's just use average annual value for the purpose of the conversation. They signed Saquon to 3 years, $39 million. They are a division opponent of the New York Giants. So the Giants let the best player on their team for 6 years running walk. It wasn't a trade, got nothing for him. Just said, yeah, we don't think you're that valuable, so feel free to go find yourself a deal that, in your opinion, pays you what your market value is. And Saquon hasn't looked back. He's been awesome for the Eagles. He completely embarrassed the Giants in the first matchup of the season. I mean, he went into the Meadowlands, or I guess it's no longer called the Meadowlands, into MetLife, and just schooled the New York Giants. To the point where you saw the clips after the fact where it's like Sirianni was like, hey, do you want to go back in? You're pretty close to your career rushing total. And class act, Saquon's like, nah, let the young guys get their touches. We've got this thing. They deserve the opportunity. I think that shows who he is compared to just how incompetent the Giants are. Like, you let this guy who was your best player for many years, you just let him go. Told him he wasn't as valuable as he thought he was. And then he has the good graces to, after completely running over you, to say, you know what? I don't need to go out there and dunk on them anymore, right? The game's over. So here's the math that we'll wrap up with. And this is just something, again, why I say typically general managers are not terminated after 3 seasons. But given where the Giants are with Joe Schoen, I think you have to move in a different direction. Daniel Jones was paid $46 million in 2023 by the Giants. He is going to count, right? Daniel Jones has been released, so he's not even finishing 2024 out. Yet the Giants are still on the hook for all of the guaranteed money that Daniel Jones is owed. Well, because of the way it's structured with, signing bonuses and how ultimately guys count against the salary cap, Daniel Jones, having been cut in or prior to week 12 of 2024, he will still count for over $22 million against the cap in 2025. So a couple numbers just to, think about here as we wrap up the episode. Daniel Jones counts for as much against the cap in 2025 when he is not on the team and hasn't been at that point for a year and a half. For the same amount of money he would have counted against the cap in 2023 had the Giants exercised his fifth-year option leading into the 2022 season. The amount of money the Giants paid Daniel Jones in both 2023 and 2024 surpasses the amount of money that the Eagles are paying Saquon Barkley in total on a 3-year contract. So we're not talking a fluke here. It would be one thing if, look, you draft a player, you take your best educated guess on them and they don't pan out. But the reason I'm really crushing Shane on this and why I think the Giants just need to move in a different direction is in both, you draft McKinney, you see him for 4 years, you know what he's about, you see what he brings, you see how he practices. Barkley even longer than that. And I understand Shane did not draft either of those players, but they proved over multiple seasons that they were key contributors. And in the case of Barkley, one of the best offensive weapons in the entire league. So I feel zero sympathy for the Giants that Barkley is having a career year in Philadelphia. He's always had this level of talent. It's just now that he's in a competent organization with better players around him, you are seeing him fully maximize what he can contribute. So the Giants need to move on from Joe Schoen. If they don't, it is a huge mistake. And what remains to be seen for the balance of the 2024 season is how much fight did the Giants have over these last 5 games? Because that will determine whether or not Daboll has even a chance of coming back in 2025.